Good morning and welcome to yet another very exciting biology class. Today we'll be looking at a very interesting topic, the respiratory system. I am your tutor, Akatre Ikechukwu Hope. So what are the objectives that we hope to accomplish by the end of this lesson? Well, by the end of this class, you should be able to explain the mechanism of respiration in worms, different worms. You should also be able to explain the mechanism of respiration in insects and talk about the various structures involved. You should be respiration in frog. And finally, you should be able to talk about the mechanism of respiration in plants and then in higher organisms like humans. Let's get started with the very first one. Most phyla in invertebrates lack specialized respiratory organs. They have developed means for the exchange of gases by the process of diffusion. In annelids like earthworm, oxygen and carbon dioxide are able to diffuse across cutaneous surface. This process of exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide across the skin is called cutaneous respiration. So what is the point? Cutaneous respiration is respiration that involves or that takes place through the skin. Well, to facilitate cutaneous respiration, the skin of the earthworm is moist and slimy due to the secretion of mucus during breathing. And I'm sure you've noticed this, that the skin of the earthworm is always moist and slimy. Oxygen diffuses across the body surface and enters blood capillaries that lie just below the skin. Blood carries the oxygen to the body cells there, and in return it picks up carbon dioxide and transports it to the skin capillaries, from where it diffuses out of the body. Unlike earthworm, insects like cockroaches have a heart and impervious exoskeleton. They do not have a single respiratory organ. Instead, the respiratory system of insects like cockroach consists of small branched cortical-lined air ducts called the trachea. These trachea forms the tracheal system. The tracheal system carries oxygen from air to all the parts of an insect's body and allows for the diffusion of gases into the tissues. The air enters into the trachea by a specialized opening present in the exoskeleton. These openings are called spiracles. These particles can be opened or closed by valves. So please take note of the point. The spiracles and the tracheal system constitutes the respiratory system, the cockroach. During the process of respiration, the oxygen-rich air rushes into the tracheal tubes through the spiracles. These are further branched into small tracheals. Tracheals are the series of tubes that transmit gases throughout the body. Carbon dioxide from the tissues diffuses into the tracheal tubes and then finally goes out through the spiracles. Oxygen diffuses into the body tissues from the tracheal and finally gets absorbed by all the cells of the body, and in return, carbon dioxide that is produced as a byproduct from the cells is released by the cells of the body. The carbon dioxide from the tissues diffuses into the tracheal tubes and finally gets out through the spiracles. So what's the point? Invertebrates like annelids and arthropods display a wide variety of respiratory organs, including the epithelium and the trachea. These adaptations also bring the external environment close to the internal fluid which circulates throughout the body of the organism. Now let's talk about respiration in amphibians like frogs. Amphibians like frogs are adapted to live both on land and in water, except for a few species of frogs that lay eggs on land. All amphibians begin their life as aquatic larvae called a tadpole. A tadpole respires through its gills and skin. When a tadpole metamorphoses into an adult frog, it develops lungs for breathing air on land. A frog is able to exchange oxygen and carbon dioxide through its skin, and that is called cutaneous respiration. When it does that through lungs, it is called pulmonary respiration, and through the lining of the mouth or buccal cavity, it is called buccal pharyngeal respiration. The exchange of gases through the frog's moist skin is known as cutaneous respiration. The skin of a frog is composed of thin membranous tissues which is permeable to gases and contains a large network of blood vessels. This allows the respiratory gases to readily diffuse down their gradient between the blood vessels and the surroundings. So can you explain why frogs will always have a moist skin? Where oxygen gases diffuses in and carbon dioxide diffuses out of the body. This mode of respiration occurs both in water and on land and requires moist skin. Thus, frogs always have moist skin due to glands which produces mucus across the skin. It accounts for more than half of the respiration in adult frogs. Cutaneous respiration also occurs during hibernation, and this is the only mode of respiration. Another mode of respiration in frogs is pulmonary respiration. Frogs use their lungs when they are active and cannot get enough oxygen from cutaneous respiration. Like humans, a frog takes in air through its nostrils. The mechanism of taking air into the lungs is, however, different from humans. This is because frogs do not have ribs or diaphragm. During breathing in, the floor of the mouth of the frog is lowered, causing air to be drawn into the mouth or buccal cavity through the nostrils. It then closes its mouth and nostrils and raises the floor of its mouth to make its mouth cavity very small. This causes an increase in pressure in the mouth cavity. The air moves from mouth through the glottis into the lungs, and which are at lower pressure. Exchange of gases occurs in the lungs during breathing out. The contraction of the muscles of the lungs pushes the air out of the lungs. Besides skin and lungs, a frog can exchange respiratory gases across the moist lining of its mouth or buccal cavity. During lung respiration, when a frog draws air into its mouth cavity, the lining of the mouth absorbs some oxygen from this inhaled air and gives out carbon dioxide. This is called buccal pharyngeal respiration. Well, as we have seen, the word amphibian means double life. Thus, the various adaptations related to amphibians' respiration have equipped them to be able to live in an aquatic and terrestrial environment. So did you take note of the various forms of respirations involved in amphibians like frog? Well, now let's talk about respiration in plants. Respiration is an inevitable process in all living organisms, including plants, humans, and others. You see, plants take an oxygen and give out carbon dioxide during respiration taking place in the night. The surfaces of the leaves have tiny pores called the stomata. Stomata are small openings which can close and open easily to aid in gaseous exchange. The opening and the closure mechanism of stomata is brought about by guard cells around the opening. So did you take note of where the guard cells are found? They are found around the opening of the stomata. Oxygen is required to break down starch in the cells. Starch is a form of sugar which gets converted into carbon dioxide and water in the presence of oxygen with the release of energy. Roots under the soil are also able to respire in order to obtain oxygen. So the root system is not left out. Now, oxygen present in the small spaces between the soil particles diffuses into the root and carbon dioxide diffuses into the soil. The energy released during the process of respiration is utilized for different processes like absorption and transportation of water and mineral nutrients from the soil into the plants. Hence, you agree that this is a very important process for plants. Aquatic plants can obtain the dissolved oxygen present in water. Gaseous exchange in these plants take place through leaves, stems, and roots. So did you take note of the structures involved? Now let's do a little activity. What is the aim of this activity? Well, we want to prove the process of respiration in plants. Now, take a small conical flask, add some amount of soil and a plant. Next, fill 1/4 of the flask with water. Close it with 2 whole rubber core and now insert a funnel made of a glass rod and a dropper rubber through another hole. Next, insert a glass tube into the flask. Connect this glass tube to a test tube with lime water. Now keep it in a complete darkness. After an hour, we shall try to add water through another funnel at another point. Did you observe that lime water in the test tube turns milky? And this proves the fact that plants can take in oxygen from water and release carbon dioxide during the process of respiration. Next is respiration in humans. We shall be looking at the lungs. The main job of the lungs is gas exchange, pulling oxygen into the body and getting rid of carbon dioxide. Normally, during inhalation, the diaphragm contracts to pull downward and chest muscles contracts to pull open the chest, which helps to suck in air just like a vacuum. And then during an exhalation, the muscle relaxes, allowing the lungs to spring back to their normal size, pushing that air out. When you breathe in, air flows through the nostrils and enters the nasal cavity, which is lined by cells that release mucus. That mucus is salty, sticky, and contains lysosomes, which are enzymes that help kill bacteria. Nose hairs at the entrance of the nasal cavities get coated with that mucus and are able to trap large particles of dust and pollens as well as bacteria, forming tiny clumps of buggers. The nasal cavity is connected to 4 sinuses, which are air-filled spaces inside the bones that surround the nose. There are the frontal, the ethmoid, the sigmoid, and the maxillary sinus. The paranasal sinuses help the inspired air to circulate for a bit so that it has time to get warm and moist. The paranasal sinuses also act like tiny echo chambers that help amplify the sound of your voice, which is why you sound so different when they are clogged with mucus during a cold. So the relatively clean, warm, moist air goes from the nasal cavity into the pharynx or the throat. The region connecting the two is called the nasopharynx, and that part connecting the pharynx to the oral cavity, I guess you know what it should be called. It is called the oropharynx. The soft palate, that is the softer portion of the roof of your mouth behind the hard parts that you can feel with your tongue, and the pendulum-like uvula hanging at the end moves together to form a flap or a valve that closes the nasopharynx off so that when you eat, it prevents food from going into the nasopharynx. Finally, there is a laryngopharynx. This is the part of the pharynx that continues with the larynx or the voice box. Up to this point, food and air share a common part. At the top of the larynx sits a spoon-shaped flap or cartilage called the epiglottis, which acts like a lid that seals the airway off when you are eating so that food can go only one way down through the esophagus and towards the stomach. If anything other than air enters the larynx, then there is a cough reflex to kick it right out. Now once air makes its way into the larynx, it then continues down to the trachea or the windpipe, which splits into 2 main stem bronchi. The point at which the split is called the carina. They then enter the lungs, and the right lung has 3 lobes, the upper, the middle, and the lower lobes, and the left lung has just 2, the upper and the lower lobes. The right main stem bronchus is wider and more vertical than the left, which is why if you accidentally inhale something big that can be coughed out, maybe like a peanut, then it's more likely to go into the right lung than the left. The main stem bronchi then divides into smaller and smaller bronchi. The trachea and the first 3 generations of bronchi are all pretty wide and use cartilage rings for support. Taking a look at a cross-section chunk, there is also a layer of smooth muscles which has nerves of the autonomic nervous system within it. The autonomic nervous system is made up of two basic types of nerves: the sympathetic nerves, which are involved in the fight or flight mood like running from a turkey or a big snake, and the parasympathetic nerves, which are involved in the rest and digest mood like eating ice cream at the beach. Smooth muscles along the trachea and the first few branches of the bronchi have beta-2 adrenergic receptors. Going back to the turkey or the big snake we talked about, when you are running, the parasympathetic nerve stimulates these beta-2 adrenergic receptors and increases the diameter of the airways. But those same airways also have what we call the muscarinic receptors, which can get stimulated by parasympathetic nerves, thus causing a decrease in the diameter of the airways. The large airways are lined mostly by ciliated columnar cells and a handful of goblet cells, which get their names from looking like a wine goblet or a glass, and they secrete mucus. That mucus helps trap particles, and then the ciliated columnar cells beat rhythmically together to move the mucus and any trapped particles from the air toward the pharynx, where they can either be spit out or swallowed. This mechanism is known as the mucociliary escalator. After the first three generations of bronchi, however, the airways become more narrow, called bronchioles, that is, little bronchi, and this can stay open without the need for cartilage. Air is conducted through smaller and smaller bronchioles for about 15 to 20 generations, and collectively they are known as conducting bronchioles. Now, the walls of the conducting bronchioles are similarly lined by ciliated columnar cells and mucus-secreting goblet cells, as well as a new type of cell called the club cells, because they look exactly like tiny clubs. These club cells secrete glycosaminoglycans, which is a material that protects the bronchiolar epithelium. These guys can transform into ciliated columnar cells, so they help regenerate and replace damaged ciliated columnar epithelial cells once it is needed. These conducting bronchioles receive oxygenated blood from the bronchial arteries. The last part of the conducting bronchioles are the terminal bronchioles. And then after that, air gets into the respiratory bronchioles, which are unique because they have a tiny outpouching that bud off of their walls. These outpouching are called alveoli, and there are about 500 million of them within the lungs. Quite interesting. Eventually, the respiratory bronchioles ends when there are nothing but alveoli, and at that point the airway is called the alveoli duct rather than a respiratory bronchiole. This is the final destination of the inhaled air. The alveoli wall has a completely different structure from the bronchioles. There are no cilia or smooth muscles, and instead the wall is lined by thin epithelial cells called pneumocytes. Most are regular pneumocytes called type 1 pneumocytes, but some called type 2 pneumocytes have the ability to secrete a substance called surfactant, which helps decrease the surface tension within the alveoli and keeps them open. Like the club cells, the type 2 pneumocytes are capable of transforming into type 1 pneumocytes so that they can help regenerate and replace damaged cells. Finally, if a tiny particle ever makes it down into the lungs, there are alveolar macrophages that can gobble it up and then physically move up to the conducting bronchioles, where they can read the mucociliary escalator all the way up to the pharynx to either be coughed up or be swallowed down. Free from particles, the inhaled air is now in the alveolus, surrounded by mostly type 1 pneumocytes. On the other side of the pneumocytes are the endothelial cells that line the ciliary walls, which is where the sweet blood is. This time though, that blood comes from the pulmonary arteries carrying the oxygenated blood. The pneumocytes and the capillaries are glued together within a protein layer called basement membrane. So the alveoli wall, the basement membrane, and the capillary wall is really all that separates the air from the blood, and this is called the blood-gas barrier. At this point, carbon dioxide diffuses out from the deoxygenated blood into the air of the alveoli, which then gets breathed out. And with each breath in, oxygen enters the alveoli and freely diffuses into the blood. That freshly oxygenated blood then heads off to the pulmonary veins, the heart, and then to the body's tissue. As a quick recap, the respiratory system facilitates gas exchange. Oxygen in the air is inhaled and makes its way through the pharynx, the larynx, the trachea, the large upper airways, conducting bronchioles, respiratory bronchioles, the alveoli, and finally the capillary to be sent to the body's tissue. Then carbon dioxide makes the reverse journey to eventually be exhaled into the world. So that's the much we can take for today's class. Please attend the questions and do the assignments that follows. Do have a wonderful day. Goodbye for now.